This is essentially a constitutional history paper regarding the power of the purse, which is an Enlightenment concept, and the budgetary reversion, which is the previous paper's status quo point. Locke, Montesquieu, Madison all have pretty brief and emphatic, but not terribly elaborated assertions that the power of the purse was essential. That was the key weapon in the arsenal of legislatures, mostly against kings. If this power is intact, Madison informs us, we can obtain a redress for every grievance. And it goes on, and it's even better than that. And if you fool around with this power, Montesquieu just states baldly, there will be no liberty. So the questions that the paper asks are three. What constitutional provisions secure a de jure power of the legislature over the purse against executive encroachment, since we might believe that executives of any stripe are in the business of encroaching? What is the constitutional history of the power of the purse? So once we get an answer to the first question, what does it look like? Are we trending up, trending down, sideways? And so what? What are the consequences of failing to endow a legislature with a firm de jure grip on the purse? So the quick answers to each question I'll run through, and then we'll go through more slowly. If you want to secure the power of the purse, first step is to actually write a constitution that says that the legislature has the right to approve taxes, sovereign debt, and annual expenditures. Some do not clear this hurdle, either because there's no legislature at all, or because, like the Saudi constitution, they make quite clear that the legislature has no budgetary power. Once you've cleared that, though, you do need a good budgetary reversion. So most constitutions now clearly stipulate what the default budget should be that will come into force if there has been no new budget adopted for the current fiscal year by the time that fiscal year starts. And you've got to make sure that that reversion, quote, favors the legislature. We'll see what I mean by that in a bit. And if you want to eviscerate the power of the purse, if you need to advise a would-be dictator on how to do this, so you can go for having no independent legislature at all, which might be appointed legislatures, of which there are a variety, or these Stalinist one-party legislatures, which are basically variants on executive appointment of the legislature. Or you could give them no powers. Again, the Saudis are the most off-top-of-head example nowadays. Or if you fail both of those and actually have a multi-party legislature that has on paper powers over the budget, you can opt for an executive favor and reversion. As far as the constitutional history goes, the short story is that the power of the purse has declined in waves corresponding roughly with and countervailing Huntington's famous waves of electoral democracy. Most of this undoing of the power of the purse has been advised in the sense that there's a constitutional moment, there's constitutional debates, there's quasi-federalist papers published in the papers, and the argument is whether or not they raise Montesquieu's views to rebut them or not is distinctly anti-Montesquieuan. The punchline is we can have a fiscally dominant executive as long as we elect one, and then we'll still be a democracy, no problem. And so in Europe, this came under the heading of rationalized parliamentarism, and in Latin America, there's not the same sort of broadly known rubric, but I call it strengthened presidentialism. The main technique that's used turns out to be, and just proportionate terms the introduction of these executive favoring reversions, although one-partyism was quite popular as a second and briefly first place for sort of middle, late parts of the 20th century. So on the third question, the quick answer is I structured the paper as a debate between Montesquieu, who says that if you surrender the power of the purse to the executive, you're going to invite tyranny, against these various constitutional architects in Chile and in France and in other cases that are discussed in the paper that argue that you can surrender the power of the purse to the executive as long as the executive's elected officer. Let's take a look at what the budgetary process that I'm going to imagine is. So there's a theoretical part of the paper which is fairly short, and it begins with the idea of a generic budgetary process. This is the extensive form, sort of put in a tabular format. So the executive, at the end of my period, it's actually true that the executive always makes the proposal, virtually everywhere. At the beginning of my period, which is 1875, that's still not quite true in quite a number of places, and that's also part of the trend. But we'll pretend that everything starts with an executive budget proposal, X sub B, and then in stage one, the legislature chooses to accept the initial proposal, in which case we go off to the last column and we get that as our final budget, or the legislature can reject the executive's proposal, in which case we go to an exogenous reversion, X sub R, and we'll see what that reversion looks like in a bit. Or the legislature can amend the executive's proposal. If the executive then accepts it, then we get X sub L. If we veto that amended version, and depending on whether we sustain or override the veto, we get back to the reversion or to the legislature's proposal. So most of the time, the model will have a single actor that controls the legislature and a single actor that controls the executive, although sometimes there's more agents running around in the legislature. So what are these exogenous reversions? In the world's constitutions, there's essentially three types, and the first two I put under the heading of executive favoring. So one reversion is that if no new budget is adopted, then the executive's proposal becomes the new budget. Another reversion is if no new budget is adopted, then last year's budget becomes next year's budget. So here's an example of a particular reversion to the executive's proposal. It's from the Chilean Constitution of 1925. So the rules roughly were that the reversion comes into force if the budget has not been adopted by the beginning of the new fiscal year. The executive can veto the budget, and the legislature needs 2/3 to override. So imagine that you are the party leader and you control a majority, but not 2/3 in both chambers of the Chilean legislature. What exactly can you do? Well, you could accept the executive's proposal, in which case you get the executive's proposal. You could do nothing, in which case the reversion kicks in, which is the executive's proposal. You could reject the executive's proposal, in which case the reversion kicks in, which is the executive's proposal. You could amend the executive's proposal and fail to override it, in which case the reversion kicks in, which is the executive's proposal. Or finally, you could look at the last column and say, gosh, if only I had more than 2/3 in both chambers, I could amend the thing and actually pass the budget. So, roughly speaking, you're powerless if you do not have over 2/3 in both chambers. Here's an example of a reversion to last year's budget from the Egyptian Constitution of 71. Reversion comes into force if the budget is not adopted by the beginning of the new fiscal year. legislature can't amend the budget. And this is more similar to the previous paper. So the executive can make a take it or leave it offer to the legislature. So whatever else we know the executive's going to get a better budget than last year's, subject to not making the legislature majority worse off. And we'll stipulate what actors care about in a little bit. But here's an example of a reversion to a government shutdown. This is the original legislature favoring reversion established after the Glorious Revolution. The Commons fought pretty hard for this. This was the whole idea in pamphlet after pamphlet that the king was paying no attention to us because he could always get money. We need to make sure that he can't get money. How can we do that? We put sunset provisions on every piece of tax authority, every loan authority, and every expenditure authority, so that it automatically expires. And then eventually they summed it all up into an annual expiration of all expenditure authority. And that's the government shutdown. So if no new budget was approved by the onset of the new fiscal year, the government shut down. That's not precisely true, of course, in the immediate aftermath, because the king still had all kinds of traditional revenues that were floating around. The way the Commons thought about this is that this gave them bargaining leverage because they could force the executive to stop spending. That's the constant mantra. If we can stop spending, if we can force the Crown to stop spending, then he'll listen to us, not otherwise. And that's indeed going to be one of the sort of outcome variables that I look at with these reversions now ratcheting through those three possibilities. Executive's proposal, last year's budget, and government shutdown. So the model roughly has that generic budgetary process, which one period model that we went through. It has an independent variable, which is the reversion, which just takes three values. It has a background context, and the background context is that the legislature can amend the budget. So we're just tossing out Egypt in this particular exercise. And I'm imagining full amendment powers. And the executive has no virement or impoundment powers. So the purpose of the background conditions is to make it stack the deck in favor of the legislature. And we'll get an a fortiori result in the sense that if things are bad for the legislature, even with these background conditions in place, they're not going to get any better if, on top of that, the executive can vire funds or impound them, or the legislature can't actually. The foreground context is either safe or dangerous, and dangerous is defined by this trio of features. First, the legislature cannot remove the executive. So presidentialism works, but there's a fair number of semi-presidential regimes that you can't actually get rid of the executive, and there's a certain number of so-called parliamentary regimes in which you can't actually get rid of the executive, at least not a bare legislative majority. If you did have this power, then presumably you could counteract any nefarious use of reversions to extract additional payoffs by just getting rid of the guy. So this is one necessary component of what this dangerous foreground context is. Another component is that the legislature cannot enact a budget against the executive's opposition. So some constitutions very carefully say the executive cannot veto the budget, which appears to be an effort to make sure that they cannot exploit the reversion by removing their ability to trigger it. Third, no limits on scope or duration of reversion. So the Germans have fairly careful restrictions on what is allowable spending after the budget is not adopted. And they've been imitated by various other countries. And then there's a bunch of Commonwealth countries that say, well, you can continue spending at last year's rate, but only for 3 months, and then the curve comes down. So that's an example of a duration limit. So none of that. So the reversion comes in, it's not limited in duration, and it's not limited in scope. So this is the quick summary of what the models in the paper seek to convince you of. I'll just give you the short stories. If we thought in terms of the largest possible cut that the legislature can impose on the executive, and now we're imagining that, again, we've got an opposition majority that controls either the single chamber in a unicameral or both chambers in a bicameral, but falls short of whatever level is needed to override executive vetoes. In that case, you can force the executive to cut the budget exactly zero if the reversion is the executive's proposal. You just go back to the Chilean table, and we're all in the columns in which the executive just hands in a proposal, and there's nothing the legislature can do effectively to stop it coming into force. If it's last year's budget, you can impose a cut that depends on the inflation rate, I over 1 plus I. And if it's a government shutdown, then of course you can impose a complete cut, 100% cut from last year's budget. Suppose you thought this was a spatial game in which X sub B is a location on a one-dimensional spatial policy space, and the Z's now are ideal points. Then if it's the executive's proposal, the executive gets their ideal point. If it's a government shutdown, then the median legislator gets to set the budget. And if it's last year's budget, then you can show that it's somewhere in this interval, intermediate between the two. So the first column for small inflation rates, last year's budget looks pretty close to executive proposal, and so I'm grouping them as executive favoring. Here it's more debatable. It depends heavily on who got the first budget to be good. And if the executive gets an initially good budget, then they can sort of perpetuate that for quite a long while into the spatial version. And then there's a version of the model, or another model in the paper, which is based on the McGuire-Olson model, where the whole issue is what's the equilibrium level of executive rents? And the answer is if it's the executive's proposal, then you get the dictator's rate of rents, which is, i.e., all parameters are chosen to maximize the dictator's fiscal residuum. If we go down to a government shutdown, then the legislature can impose nil rents on the dictator, and then we get intermediate in the case of last year's budget. The theoretical summary is that these executive favored reversions, at least in these dangerous institutional contexts, pretty much eviscerate the de jure power of the purse, regardless of whether you measure it in terms of can the legislature actually force any spending reduction, can they determine the ideological cast of the budget, can they limit executive rents. So the theoretical summary is just to try to get you to think that this looks like a good initial weapon for an executive or a legislature, without stipulating particular bargaining gauge. When you do that, you largely get sensible results, but it does depend even more on what particular context you have in mind and stipulate, i.e. a vector of other capacities that the legislature and executive have, in particular these environment and empowerment powers, which are widely variable across the Constitution. So I'm trying to focus in on a case that's pretty favorable to the legislature on many dimensions and show you how the wherewithal, or the reversion affects wherewithal as an input into a bargaining game. Most of it now is going to look at what's the constitutional history. So no one has actually looked at budgetary reversions that are mandated in constitutions over time. There's a variety of regional or country studies, such as Alcina et al. Sheba provides a somewhat broader coverage over both in terms of countries and years, but he's using significantly different coding rules than I'm going to talk about in a moment. And his purpose is certainly not to look at the constitutional history. It's really a comparison between parliamentarism and presidentialism. So the data set here codes 1875 to 2005, every country from the first year in which it operated as an independent sovereign entity under a written constitution until 2005, and it excludes years before 1875 and countries that don't have a population exceeding 1 million by 1990. So the content just codes these constitutionally stipulated budgetary reversions. Is it the executive's proposal? Is it last year's budget? Is it a government shutdown? Constitutions become increasingly explicit about this. In 1875, there's quite a number that are implicit and have to be coded by somewhat more elaborate coding rules. But by the end of the period, they just say it. These are all de jure codings, not de facto, meaning it's just reading the Constitution. These are all constitutional codings, not statutory, meaning that a lot of countries will have statutes that regulate their budget process. And so some of the Latin American countries that don't have a constitutional reversion, mimicking the Chilean, have a statutory reversion that mimics the Chilean. So here's the raw beginnings of the data. So the blue line just gives you the number of constitutions that mandate executive favoring reversions. And the red gives the percent of constitutions in force at a given year. So the number goes steadily up, and that's partly driven by the fact that there's more sovereign states over time, and the percentage goes roughly doubles from about a third to about 2/3. If you break this down in terms of executive favoring reversion to the executive proposal and reversion to last year's budget, you find that both of those are going up at about the same pace, and executive's budget is taking a larger percentage over time. So suppose you revisit these democracy waves. The blue is the original Huntington waves of electoral democracies, defined primarily in terms of the health of the electoral system. And as you see, we're getting more democratic with each wave, roughly speaking, and particularly in the third wave. And then the red simply adds on a requirement that you have a reversion that allows the actually, it's a little bit more than this. It's, do you have a legislature that exercises the power of the purse, which means they have to have the powers, they have to be independent, and they have to have a reversion that doesn't favor the executive. And then you see we sort of peak in terms of democracy around 1925, which is right before parliamentarism, rationalisé begins, and the move towards strengthened presidentialism in Latin America picks up steam. Dangerous to say that almost all of these cases that have a reversion to either the executive proposal or last year's budget are in these dangerous contexts. And many of them are apparently parliamentary. So you'll look at them and they say they have the prime minister, and then you read the fine print and it takes a 2/3 majority to expel the prime minister. Or there's something else that's equally debilitating. So exogenous or endogenous. There's 148 new EFRs that sort of pop up into the data set at one time or another, and about 2/3 arise because a country's founding constitution creates an EFR, and I'm going to view these in the empirics as if they were randomly assigned because it depended on which European conquered you when. So if you were conquered by the British, you end up with a legislature favoring reversion. If you were conquered by the French, you end up with an executive favoring reversion, largely by imitating France 5. Another third are conversions from LFRs to EFRs, and obviously these are self-selected. A lot of them, actually a minority come in via coups, and a fair bulk come in by actual constitutional amendments. So the France 5 or the Chilean 25 constitution were not coups followed by very short not quite, not as obvious as some coups. Part of the paper looks a lot at the endogenous EFRs because this can also help you get at Bob's question of why should last year's budget be viewed as executive favoring. And the brief story on what's happening when these reversions come in is that there's an episode of inefficient budgetary gridlock. And so an example of that is the House Republicans and Obama, and we get a credit downgrade. So that's an inefficient outcome. Neither party was made better off. Just as in rationalist theories of war, they could have reached a deal ahead of time that avoided that cost. Why didn't they? There's various on-offer explanations for why they didn't, but it's clearly inefficient. And the parliamentary era in Chile is characterized in the same way. A whole series of budgets that are not passed on time. That's exactly the leverage that the legislature uses to extract concessions from the executive. Indeed, grievances before supply is a rallying cry that says that's what you should do. That's how you exert your authority as a legislature. But it necessarily entails a risk of this sort of inefficiency in the bargaining process. So when you get a lot of this, it turns out that the business elite are not happy. Ordinary people are not particularly happy. And you then have two options to break the gridlock. And one option is break the legislature's veto, and you can do that by putting in an EFR and ensuring that the legislature cannot remove the executive. And this is by far the most popular solution. And it's actually the solution that's being offered right now in the US, although we may not have time to get to that. And then the other solution is to break the executive's veto and make it quite clear that the LFR is here to stay and ensure that the legislature can remove the executive. At that point, you can't have these inefficient budgetary conflicts any longer because the legislature simply removes the executive as soon as there's any disagreement. So these inefficient budgetary gridlock episodes typically arise in situations where the rules endow both sides with an ability to affect the budget, but don't have either parliamentarism or some clear executive dominance to avoid the actual deficiencies in the bargain. So the main cases of this that I look at are Chile and France 5, but France 5 then turns into a whole bunch of Francophone cases. So quickly looking at consequences of this sort of sea change in constitutions, I look at public finances. Most of the work on that is historical, before and after the Glorious Revolution, before and after the Prussian reforms, before and after various 19th century reforms, and Checo does most of that. You could conceivably look at the spatial location of final budgets before and after EFRs are introduced. There's not a lot of data to prosecute that. And so I'm going to look at executive rents and leadership succession and tell a quick series of stories. So EFRs allow executives to extract rents. That's one of the model's claims. And rents motivate and enable these incumbents to entrench themselves in power. They've got the money, so they can buy votes, both in the legislature and in the electorate. And they can, with their money in the legislature, they buy things like lifetime presidencies or rules that make it more and more implausible that they could ever lose an election. Challengers like the rents. They look good. The presidential palace looks better than it used to. But these EFRs create a clear commitment problem. The executive can renege on any promise of future rents because they can simply dictate the budget in future. So if any of their promises to their colleagues rely on a flow of future rents being credible, they're in a bit of trouble. And if challengers reject the incumbent's offer, possibly because they don't find it credible, they're likely to mount a military rather than a constitutional challenge because the incumbent has rigged all the constitutional avenues. So that's the rough story, and the empirics then try to give you a little bit of evidence, correlational on each score. So the World Bank has a list of kleptocrats and an attempt to estimate how much they stole per capita per annum. And if you combine these kleptocrats and then run through and see how many had EFRs, the answer is 20 out of 21. And then if you accept a identification condition, which is that the World Bank's list was compiled conditional on the true type of the leader with no impact at all from the LFR or EFR, then you can conclude that kleptocrats are 13 times more likely under an EFR than an LFR. There's other sort of correlational stuff on the rent extraction from transparency. They correlate with constitutional entrenchment. There's just a variety of different ways to measure, is this executive entrenched? And yes, the answer is true. And then they correlate with extra-constitutional seizures of power, correlating, controlling for various stuff. So conclusions. They provide an arsenal that allows any reasonably competent executive playing any particular game to eviscerate the power of the purse and get lots of things. It's not quite clear what they want to cash it in as, but it's an arsenal that they can cash in as. They become vastly more common over the period 1875 to 2005, and they correlate pretty strongly. In this paper, we looked at higher rents, entrenchment, and extra-constitutional succession. So, stop there.